So as the Civil War enters its third week, estimates put the number of deaths nationwide at over 185,000 people. Also, over 1 million people have been left homeless and around 250,000 people have left the country since the start of the war. Absolute shocking figures, and it only looks to get worse as the intensity in fighting increases across the country. The highest number of casualties have been in, unsurprisingly, the worst affected states. Those being Nevada, Idaho, Oklahoma, and South Carolina, though of course every state has experienced its fair share of fighting. The president has said that despite large swathes of the country being under militia control, the military is winning and will ultimately win this war. This comes as speculation increases that some military personnel are refusing to fight against their own countrymen and some are sympathizing with the militias. The president has warned that any military personnel who refuse to fulfill their duty of protecting the country will be court-martialed and given the death penalty if found guilty. The president made good on his word this morning when a naval officer who refused to fire on a militia ship in the Gulf of Mexico last week was executed by firing squad. The reintroduction of death by firing squad was introduced on the fourth day of the war for those deemed enemies of the state. Since then, only 2 people, one being the naval officer and the other being a 25-year-old Marine from Texas, have been executed by firing squad. The president said that intelligence suggests that some members of the military were involved in the attack on the White House on Tuesday afternoon when members of a militia stormed the grounds of the White House and gained access to the residence shortly after. Within 5 minutes, smoke could be seen rising from the roof of the White House as shots rang out around the property. 8 security service personnel were killed in the attack, with one being shot execution style in the back of the head on the lawns of the White House. The president was not present at the White House at the time, nor were any members of his family. But he has said that the punishment for those responsible for the attack will be swift and deadly. The current whereabouts of the president is unknown as fighting rages within the Capitol. With numerous militias joining forces, they are rolling through the streets in black armored vehicles and black battle tanks, the color that has become synonymous with the revolution. The militia's acquirement of battle tanks in many states have confirmed reports that sources within the military are providing some militias with military-grade weapons. The militia faction based in northern Alabama known as Upholders of the Constitution were even seen flying over Huntsville in an A-64 Apache helicopter, which was spray-painted black. Huntsville is currently under full militia control with huge support from local communities there for the militias, with thousands of gun owners in the area taking up arms against the military. The military admitted that military operations in the area had ceased for the time being, but that the full recapturing of Huntsville is only a matter of time. During the 8 days of fighting there, over 1,000 people were killed, including 216 military personnel. So things may be calm in Huntsville for the time being. But the same can't be said for many other cities across America where the fighting continues and the intensity of it increases. This follows reports from Phoenix, Arizona, where in the last hour videos have been circulating online of buildings in downtown Phoenix crumbling and falling like dominoes after numerous airstrikes by the military. The military released a statement saying that militias in the area had taken over entire apartment complexes and that warnings to evacuate were given to residents prior to the strikes. Locals, however, said that very little time was given to evacuate and that hundreds of people, including children, are now buried beneath the rubble of destroyed buildings. Rescue efforts have been halted as fighting continues within the city, with militias in the area showing a huge amount of firepower. Videos online show dozens of injured soldiers being stretchered through the streets while under fire from the militias. Our correspondent Michael Hardmore described the scenes as like something out of the last days of Berlin. The streets of Phoenix covered in blood, dust, and rubble as screams and gunfire continue in the background. A military chopper was seen plummeting to the ground after being shot out of the sky by militias, and some estimates put the number of deaths at over 2,000 in just over 3 hours of fighting. That number is expected to rise as military reinforcements make their way to the area in an attempt to retake a city they say is a hub of militia activity and a breeding ground for terrorists. Many angry locals, however, have sworn to take up weapons and fight on the side of the militias after the airstrikes by the military on residential buildings, which could possibly have killed hundreds of innocent civilians. This battle has already been described as possibly the biggest battle of the war so far, and fears of this level of fighting spreading across America and other cities is now widespread. The brutal measures taken by government in trying to stamp out this uprising has only seemed to backfire on the government as thousands of Americans continue to join militias across the country on a daily basis. This current situation in Phoenix, with reports of so many civilian deaths, will only bolster support for the militias. It's been reported that militias are recruiting people as young as 13, and the president has said this goes to show the level of disregard the militias have for human life. A militia faction based in North Carolina, however, released a statement saying that those being recruited at the age of 13 and 14 had as much of a right to defend their country against tyranny as anyone else. This war was, of course, sparked by the introduction of nationwide martial law, which was viewed as unwarranted by millions of Americans and a power grab by a rising totalitarian system of corporate elites. Militias nationwide have vowed to fight until the very end, saying that the conflict will continue until the treacherous infestation of global elitists in American politics are removed from power. They have demanded that the president step down, saying that he will remove himself from power or they will do it for him. The president did not respond to the demands when questioned about it, but instead addressed the ban on travel to and from the United States. Since March 3rd, there has been a ban on all commercial planes and ships entering and leaving the country. According to the president, this is to stop the influx of those coming from abroad to join illegal organizations, meaning the militias, and also to stop military personnel from leaving the country and evading their duty of defending the country. This, however, hasn't stopped hundreds of thousands of Americans from attempting to leave the country, and the president has said that those found guilty of violating the travel ban could face up to 10 years in prison. Last week, a ship carrying 317 passengers in the Gulf of Mexico was sank by the Navy after refusing orders to stop. 191 people were killed in the incident, including 63 children. Of those on board were mostly family trying to make their way to Mexico after fighting erupted in Central Florida. In relation to the incident, the president said that although it was tragic and extremely saddening that so many children had lost their lives, ultimately it was the parents who were to blame because they had willingly broken the law in a time of national emergency and put the lives of their children at risk. The words of the president were met with extreme anger across the country, and as a result, further rioting broke out, resulting in the deaths of over 800 people over a 4-day period. Many of those killed were young people who were apparently part of more-raiding gangs who were looting shops throughout American cities and were shot by shop owners trying to protect their property. Many, however, have disagreed, saying the majority of those killed were peaceful protesters who posed no threat and were shot dead by riot police. The riots left thousands of supermarkets throughout the country without food and basic necessities because of widespread looting and with the transportation of goods at a minimum because of the dangers of traveling through potential conflict zones. The supply of food throughout the country is a real concern at the moment. Millions of Americans are already saying that they are running dangerously low on food, and panic is breaking out as the World Food Program warns that famine across the country is a real possibility if supplies do not start getting through to the worst affected areas very soon. Already the amount of people left homeless because of this war is in the millions, as community after community is left devastated by the fighting. Earlier we saw footage of numerous suburbs on the outskirts of Los Angeles which were absolutely flattened during the early stages of this war, and kids rummaging through the trash and rubble in search of their next meal. Absolutely heartbreaking scenes there, and those scenes are being mirrored all over the country, despite the president saying that aid is getting through to the areas that need it most. Many, however, are saying that is simply not true, and that their communities are on the brink of starvation. So as we see, this war is not just simply affecting those directly involved in the fighting. It is having widespread consequences for everybody, and in fact it is those who are simply just trying to get by who are suffering the most. Many leaders around the world are calling on the president to negotiate with the militias and strike a peace deal. However, the president has reiterated that he will, quote, never ever negotiate with terrorists. The British Prime Minister supported the president's decision, saying that the militias were nothing but terrorists, and that an attack on one democracy was an attack on all. The British Prime Minister is facing his own problems in Britain, where anti-government sentiment is growing and support for the militias amongst the British public is at an all-time high, a recent poll suggesting that 59% of Britons support or sympathize with the militias. There is fear around the world that the war could spark other conflicts around the world, with mass anti-government protests taking place across Europe and South America. Some of these protests have turned violent, with protesters clashing with riot police in many European cities. 17 police officers have also been killed during protests that turned violent in Brazil and Colombia. But anyway, back to the situation here, where updates are coming through on the fierce battle taking place in Phoenix, Arizona. Locals are now taking part in the fight against the military, and northern Phoenix is apparently under full militia control. This is despite continued airstrikes by the military and a massive ground offensive which is currently underway. Reports and footage suggest that this is by far the largest battle of the war so far, and that the number of casualties are well into the thousands. Drone footage shows the devastation that has been brought on the city in the space of just a few hours. Many buildings in the city center reduced to rubble, plumes of smoke billowing from the blood-stained, dust-covered streets, and people in the thousands running for their lives amid gunfire from both sides and missiles from above. Crazy scenes there, and I'm sure you're probably witnessing on your TV screens as we speak. Things are also heating up in the Capitol, where the Capitol building, yes, you heard me right, Capitol Hill, has been hit by militia tank fire, and not just hit once, but hit multiple times. The dome of the Capitol building has been completely blown off, and a number of the pillars that once stood at the front are now just rubble strewn across the area. It's understood that nobody was in the building at the time, as the city had long been evacuated by any officials when fighting first broke out. The attack is being celebrated by many people across the country who see it as a symbolic step towards the downfall of a failed and corrupt system. Numerous militias are currently engaged in on the ground fighting with military troops, and reports suggest that the city is lost to the militias, who have overran it in the thousands using tanks and armored vehicles sourced from militia sympathizers within the military. The president has vowed to hunt down those responsible for supplying the enemy with weaponry, and said that betrayal of one's country cannot and will not be forgiven. While a lot of the focus in these past 3 weeks has been on the fighting taking place in major urban areas across the country, where the military has had quite a large amount of success, it is the more rural areas that are failing to make the headlines. However, it is in the rural areas that militias are inflicting huge amounts of casualties, and where the military is primarily losing the battle as militias adopt a guerrilla warfare approach, attacking convoys en route to more urban areas and attacking military checkpoints along rural roads. Huge rural swathes of the country are under militia control in every state in the country, and just as one militia faction is crushed, another emerges to continue the fight. Experts warn that this could be a long, drawn-out war of attrition that could continue for several more months, if not years, with more and more people joining militias across the country and morale within the military at an all-time low. Other military analysts have suggested that the American military could concede defeat in the coming weeks, and even defy orders to continue fighting, something the president has dismissed and described as, quote, defeatist traitor talk. But the president's concerns won't be eased anytime soon, because news just in that the Secretary of Defense, Kurt Crimer, has been killed. Information is sketchy, but apparently the car that he was a passenger in exploded while on its way to Denver, Colorado, and he was pronounced dead at the scene. I'll update you on that situation when we have more information available, but it sounds like a device of some sort was planted in the car, under the car. We don't know yet. But to repeat, Kurt Crimer, the Secretary of Defense, has been killed. I'm sure a statement will be released soon regarding that situation.
More information on the death of Kurt Crimer, the Secretary of Defense, who was on his way to Denver, Colorado, when his car exploded and he was pronounced dead at the scene along with the driver of the car. A militia known as MX-50 have claimed responsibility for the killing, saying that every agent of the government, big or small, are a legitimate target. Kurt Crimer was, of course, one of the main advocates for the introduction of nationwide martial law, the law which ultimately led to war, and so his death will be viewed as a huge victory for the militias. The president is yet to comment on the situation, and the current whereabouts of the president remains unknown since the attack on the White House. But his security team will now be on even higher alert after the death of his lifelong friend and associate, Kurt Crimer.
doom and gloom out there at the moment, but we can't stop trying to enjoy the things which make us human, and one of those things is music. So we're going to play a track from the Penny Pinchers album Blossom, and hopefully this will remind us that despite all the devastation and the suffering that humanity can inflict on one another, and the pain and misery we can cause, we can also create something beautiful, and we shouldn't forget that. So here it is, Through the Vines by the Penny Pinchers. So there you go, no words, just an instrumental, but sometimes no words are needed. Isn't it good to hear some music though? It kind of transports you back to the good old times of a little over 3 weeks ago, before we all started murdering each other. Anyway, as unlikely as it seems at the moment, let's hope that a peaceful resolution can be reached. Too many people have already died, too goddamn many, and it makes me angry. Enough is enough. Oh shit, that blast was very, very close to our studio. Yeah, that sounded extremely close. I think I might have to go for it now.
With more news on Kurt Kreimer's death, but for now let's take a broad look at what is currently going on around the country to try and get up to date with things. So we know that Phoenix, Arizona is in the grips of a ferocious battle, with militias currently holding the north of the city, fierce street battles in and around the city center, and airstrikes continuing on targets believed to be housing militants. Thousands already feared dead there. That battle has been described as the biggest of the war so far. Tens of thousands of citizens are attempting to flee the city, with many being caught in the crossfire, while some are staying put in their homes and hoping for the best. We'll keep a close eye on the situation there and update you on developments as best we can. But there is so much fighting going on. WSE major battles, minor battles, skirmishes, and whatnot. It's hard to keep up with things, not to mention the rioting that is widespread also, but we'll do our best to cover what we can. As you probably already know, Capitol Hill was attacked by militias who rolled through the Capitol in battle tanks, one of them being an Abram, all of them spray painted black. The militia proceeded to fire at the Capitol building, blown in the dome-like structure off the top of the building. Also, the massive pillars at the front of the building blown to smithereens. Nobody was inside the building at the time, but shortly after, the militia engaged in ferocious fighting with the military. Footage showed dozens of bodies, both militia and state military strewn across the Capitol streets, while the sound of fighting continued in the distance. So let's take a quick look at which cities are currently experiencing most of the fighting, and to what extent. Okay, first off, New Orleans, a heavy militia presence there, an estimated 500 people killed there since the start of the war, militia, military, and civilian. Minneapolis, quiet at the start of the war, but then erupted in violence after a soldier shot and killed 2 teenagers who threw rocks at a military checkpoint. Over 700 have been killed there since the war began. Next, Sacramento, which has not seen heavy fighting on the part of any militia faction, but rather lone wolf militants carrying out sporadic attacks, one of which was a bomb that was planted in the Central District, which killed 381 people and injured over 500. Nearly 600 people have been killed there since the start of the war. Atlanta, Georgia, is another city that has been embroiled in fighting, an estimated 1,140 people killed there in just over 10 days of fighting and rioting. Next up, Portland, Oregon. Heavy fighting in the first few days of the war that seems to have subsided somewhat, but over 1,700 people estimated to have been killed there, mostly civilians who were caught up in the crossfire between militia and the military in the early days of the war. Okay, who's next? Louisville, Kentucky, a hotbed for militia activity, 3,000. Well, I wasn't expecting that. Estimates put the number of deaths, civilian, militia, and military at just over 3,000. I had no idea that many people had been killed in Louisiana. Baltimore next, where we have the worst rioting in the country, also coinciding with heavy fighting driving the number of those killed up to over 2,000. These figures are heartbreaking. It's hard to believe this is what our country has come to. It really is. Whatever side you are on, I don't care. If you have lost someone, my heart goes out to you. I pray you somehow find comfort in these dark times. Toledo, Ohio, with a population of about 270,000 people, has suffered an extraordinary amount of casualties. Considering its relatively small population, 3,300 people are estimated to have been killed. That is a crazy figure. That city has taken a battering since the start of the war. The outskirts of the city has been reduced to rubble after relentless airstrikes targeting militia bases in and around the city. A lot of collateral damage, which the military blamed on the militias, accusing them of using families as human shields. A devastating number of deaths, and so sad. Albuquerque, New Mexico, 1,800 dead. Tucson, Arizona, nearly 2,000 confirmed killed. El Paso, Texas, the number of deaths currently at 762. Fort Worth, Texas, 1,689. This is insane. Jacksonville, Florida, estimated number of people killed, 2,400. And estimates now put the death toll in Phoenix at 6,000. Oh my dear God, that is crazy. You've probably seen some bits and pieces of footage from there. Crazy scenes, crazy scenes. Houston, Texas. Oh my dear Lord, 4,300, is that correct? Can someone please verify that? I didn't know that there was anywhere near that amount killed in Houston. Chicago, Illinois, 1,100. The greater Los Angeles area, 3,300 is the current estimates. And as for our largest city in terms of population, New York, 2,800. Now, of course, those figures I've just given don't account for the entirety of deaths across the country since the start of the war. Estimates nationwide are between 175,000 and 185,000, but of course many have been killed in other smaller cities and towns and also rural areas. What percentage of those deaths are military, militia, and civilian? I don't know. I don't have those figures in front of me. Maybe someone could look that up, and I also don't. If those estimates, I mean the nationwide estimates, are deaths as a direct result of the war in terms of those wounded and killed, or if it also includes those killed in the riot. But regardless, it is extremely surreal to be reading those figures. It is sad, sickening, and so hard to get your head around the fact that we're talking about America here, not some far-off, war-torn region of the world, but the United States of America. And you know, I am reading off those figures like it's just numbers on the paper of a math exam, but every single one of those numbers is a person. And it is horrifically sad. So I don't want you to think that I am being nonchalant about those figures. They are heartbreaking, and my thoughts and prayers go out to everyone who has lost someone in this war, and I hope it ends soon, really, really soon, because I don't want to have to read any more figures like that. You know, so come on, America. Let's pull together and find a peaceful way out of this. Stop the bloodshed. Stop the killing of so many innocent lives. War is not the answer. There has to be negotiations. And I'm not taking any sides, but goddamn it, Mr. President, get your head out of your ass and start doing something productive instead of ordering the indiscriminate bombing of city centers with at best sketchy intelligence about militias hiding out there. And I said I wasn't taking any sides, but if all it takes to stop this is for you to step down, then for God's sake, step down. Is it that damn hard? Is your stubbornness and desire to hold on to power really worth the lives of hundreds of thousands of Americans, your own people? Is that how much you crave power? Am I missing something? I just don't get it. Anyway, we're going to go over
of communication down, and so millions of Americans are without the means of communication that they once had to talk to family, friends, and generally share their experiences, which helps in a time like this. People need literally a shoulder to cry on, but with many instant messaging services being basically shut down by government to stop the spread of apparent misinformation and disrupt the means of communication between the militias, people are lonely. That's what a lot of people are saying. We are not used to living in an age where we cannot instantly communicate with someone. And it's been 3 weeks now, or just over 3 weeks since this war kicked off. But many have still not come to terms with it. They are questioning their new reality, and some are simply unable to deal with it because, let's face it, we as a people are not mentally equipped to deal with this. We fold and throw a hissy fit when we find something offensive, over whether or not someone calls us he, she, them, it, him, her, and whatever other gender pronouns have been added to the never-ending list of imaginary states of being. Well, now we have a real problem on our hands, an actual real-world problem, and a lot of our people, not all of them of course, but I would think a large minority, not majority, but minority, are unable to deal with it. We are used to instant gratification through drugs, alcohol, porn, junk food, Instagram likes, lobotomized TV entertainment, thought-suppressing pop music, and now, well, a lot of those things are no longer accessible and people are cracking up. Alongside the war, we've got nationwide rioting and lone gunmen and...
Last 10 minutes, a coordinated effort by the military to once and for all put an end to the battle for Houston. Thousands of reinforcements are currently on their way to the city to carry out a massive ground offensive. The United Nations are warning of a possible massacre should that happen, with tens of thousands of civilians trapped inside the city, afraid to leave their homes in case of being caught up in the fighting that has intensified over the past hour with news of reinforcements on the way. The same plan, a massive ground offensive, is planned for Phoenix in the coming days, once the military have, quote, completely and utterly destroyed the morale of militant terrorists through relentless precision point airstrikes. Phoenix has seen the most intense fighting of the war so far. What started out as light gunfire for a number of weeks erupted into absolute mayhem, with thousands killed and injured in the space of just a few hours. Experts have warned that this war is going to get a lot worse, that this is only the tip of the iceberg in terms of the fighting we have so far seen. Why, you may ask? Well, rumors are circulating that tens of thousands of militia supporters in Canada are planning to mount attacks along the border and infiltrate America to fight alongside the militias. The president has already had his say on this, posting the following on X: "Big mistake. If strikes must be carried out on Canadian soil to prevent an attack, you better believe we will do it. Stand down." The Canadian Prime Minister responded by saying that militia supporters from Canada planning an attack on American soil would be hunted down and brought to justice, even talking about bringing back the death penalty for those who put Canadian national security at risk. He also responded to the president's remark about possible airstrikes on Canadian soil, saying that such a decision would be a grave mistake and would forever tarnish relations between the two countries. This, however, is unlikely to dissuade the president should an attack occur, which is looking like a very real...
Like with a huge escalation in fighting across the country in the past couple of hours, the Air Force literally carpet-bombing some areas, militia factions moving in huge numbers across rural areas adopting a guerrilla warfare type approach, then also many of them engaged in on the ground fighting with the military in cities and towns across the country. Alaska, which was basically untouched as far as this war was concerned, is now also embroiled in fighting. The streets of Fairbanks and Anchorage are a scene of chaos, so this conflict has spread like no one expected. Even in the first few days of this conflict, most people imagined that the military would crush this revolution, uprising, or whatever you want to call it, but that's proved very, very difficult. Thousands of casualties on both sides as the world looks on in shock and disbelief as the country rips itself apart from the inside. Of course, there are not just two sides to this story or two sides fighting. It is not just a case of the military versus the militias. There is the military itself, but then you also have hundreds of thousands of supporters of the military taking up arms to fight, which is adding to the confusion. The military are finding it difficult to distinguish who is militia and who is an average citizen fighting on their side, and so the military have called on those people to put down their weapons and let the military do its job. Then you have the militia and their supporters who are also engaged in the fighting, who do not belong to one particular militia but fight independently. This also is adding to confusion for both the military and militias. Then you have lone wolves simply opening fire on the public, seemingly just enjoying and taking advantage of the chaos, supporting neither side, and just killing for the sake of killing. Then amongst the militias themselves, there are conflicting ideologies and different aims that they want to achieve. And so this is leading to tension amongst the militias, which could lead to a war within a war. Something the military would be quite happy to see, hoping that the militias begin fighting amongst themselves for control of certain areas as their ideologies and opinions clash. After which the military could swoop in, clean up the carnage, and re-establish full military control. So we are in this for the long haul, folks. There is no quick or easy solution to this. The only way I can see this ending anytime soon is if the president steps down and calls a halt to military operations, which is very unlikely. If anything, it's more likely that he will try to tighten his grip on power, and his methods of dealing with the militias will become even more extreme. As he said just last week, nothing is off the table. What exactly he means by that, we don't know, but he even mentioned napalm in an off-the-cuff remark with reporters. However, we don't know the context of that conversation.
Apparently over 5,000 people have now been killed in the fighting in and around Oklahoma City. A shocking number of people. That includes military, militia, and civilian deaths. But the highest number is now in Phoenix, Arizona.
That the ringleader of this militia, an ex-U.S. Army Marine named Joshua Wilkins, will not be actively taking part in the fighting, but rather giving the orders to his troops on what to do next. The situation.
The president has been shot. President De La Rosa has been shot.
Breaking news. President De La Rosa has been shot just outside Richmond, Virginia. President De La Rosa shot. We don't know if he was fatally injured, but it has been confirmed that the president was shot.
News coming through. President De La Rosa has been shot. He has been shot. That is news just in. De La Rosa has been shot. A militia calling itself the VV-50 have claimed responsibility.
Outside Richmond, Virginia, believed to have been shot by a sniper while exiting the vehicle he was been driven in. And it's been confirmed. The president is dead. President De La Rosa is dead.
President De La Rosa is dead after being fatally shot just outside Richmond, Virginia. A militia group calling itself the VV-50 have claimed responsibility for his killing. It's believed he was killed while exiting the car he was being driven in at a property just outside Richmond, Virginia. Apparently, the president was hit once in the neck by a suspected sniper, and he died almost instantly from excessive blood loss. For those of you who might be just joining us, the president is dead. A militia group called the VV-50 have claimed responsibility. Shocking, shocking news. De La Rosa is dead.
President De La Rosa was shot while exiting the vehicle he was been driven in. It happened just outside Richmond, Virginia. Apparently, he died of excessive blood loss after being shot in the neck. He passed away within a few short minutes. The shooter or shooters have not yet been apprehended, but a militia faction calling itself the VV-50 claimed responsibility for the president's killing. Leaders around the world have been reacting to the news. The British Prime Minister, Benjamin Richards, calling it an abhorrent act of cold-blooded murder, adding that the president was a true friend and a staunch ally of Great Britain. The French president called it an act of terrorism and said those responsible will ultimately be caught and brought to justice, adding that President De La Rosa was a beacon of hope in a time when democracy is being challenged around the world. The president's death comes just hours after his close friend Kurt Crimer was assassinated while on his way to Denver, Colorado. What this now means for the war is anyone's guess. Does the president's death spell the end, and will military operations be temporarily put on hold until a replacement is found? It seems somewhat insensitive to be asking these questions so soon after the news of the president's death. But this will now be the question on everyone's mind. What happens next?
Shocking news about the death of President De La Rosa. Of course, we knew his life was in danger, but nobody truly expected this to happen. We haven't had an incident like this since the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963. But of course, the circumstances surrounding the death of President De La Rosa are very different from those in 1963. We are embroiled in a vicious civil war, and this goes to show that nobody is safe in a time like this. Kurt Crimer first, and now President De La Rosa, a president who's loved and will be missed by many, but also a president that many millions of Americans will be glad to see the back off. He was a controversial figure who vowed to someday completely criminalize gun ownership, scrap what he thought was an outdated constitution, and of course introduced nationwide martial law, a very brutal nationwide martial law which has ignited war on a scale that has never been seen on American soil. So, as people are still in a state of shock over this news and trying to come to terms with it, the question must be asked, what happens next? Now, of course, this is rumor, a conspiracy theory, whatever you want to call it, but some are saying that those within government, President De La Rosa's very own people, may have had a hand in his killing. I'll repeat, this is speculation, but some people within the government may have had an involvement in the president's murder. Why? Well, apparently there had been widespread discontent growing within the government about President De La Rosa's handling of the conflict, and some, or many, simply wanted him gone. So we're talking about a possible inside job here. Maybe some collusion between government officials and a militia faction to take care of a mutual problem, so to speak. However, if that is the case, that there was collusion between government officials and the militias, are we possibly headed towards negotiations between the two sides? Something President De La Rosa was firmly against and refused to ever do. Personally, my gut instinct tells me that there was no collusion, no inside job. This was simply the work of the group calling themselves the VV-50. It was a well-executed, well-planned assassination, and this war will continue to grow in intensity with many more casualties to come. Of course, the death of the president will dominate the airwaves and every media outlet for the next while. But as we speak, the intensity of fighting throughout the country continues to spread. 9,000 now feared dead in Phoenix, Arizona. Nationwide, the number of deaths must be at almost 200,000 people. An insane amount of lives lost. Absolutely tragic. Now, news just in. Vice President Brian Bischoff will temporarily take over presidential duties. Probably not much surprise there, but he's going to have one hell of a job. Will he negotiate? Will he continue the fight? Who knows? Only him, I guess. Brian Bishop.
Say that the mastermind behind the murder of the president has been under their radar for quite some time, and he will be caught and he will pay for his actions. We don't know who it is specifically that they are talking about, but it sounds as though they know who their man is, or at least they are giving that impression. It was a militia group known as the VV-50 who claimed responsibility for the murder, and as well as there being widespread outrage about the president's killing, there has also been, as expected, widespread celebration. Some seem to be celebrating as if the war is won, but the repercussions of President De La Rosa's murder may be like nothing the militia has yet seen. We could see the military unleash an unholy amount of revenge on areas with large militia support.
An absolutely massive explosion at the U.S. Army recruiting office in Times Square, New York. This is news just in. There has been a huge explosion at the U.S. Army recruiting office in Times Square in New York. We don't have much information on it as yet, but it sounds like there could be an awful lot of casualties. We're giving you the news as we hear about it ourselves. So all we know for now, a massive explosion at an Army recruitment center in Times Square. Yeah, so we're hearing that windows of buildings over 1.5 kilometers from the blast were shattered. Such was the ferocity of this explosion. What caused it or who caused it is yet unknown, but seeing that it was an Army recruitment center that was targeted, you would have to suspect it was the work of a militia faction, although no militia has made a statement on the incident as yet. We're still waiting to get more information on that, but sadly it sounds like hundreds of people may have been injured or killed in the blast.
Well, that was Matt Hinchley reporting on the current situation in Times Square, and sadly, as he said, it sounds like there could be a huge amount of casualties. Times Square at the time of the explosion was packed with crowds of people, mostly protesters, riot police, and generally just people out and about. When at 11 minutes past 9 local time, a huge explosion rocked Times Square, and the area is currently a scene of chaos, screaming as many appear to be trapped beneath rubble and debris. Awful scenes there. As Matt was saying, we don't know yet what or who caused this, but shocking scenes right now that we are witnessing on the streets of New York and the now unrecognizable remains of Times Square.
So much to try and report on with the death of President De La Rosa, or I should say the once President De La Rosa. People obviously still reeling from the shock of that, but of course the president's murder didn't exactly come out of the blue. We are in the middle of a war, so obviously things of this nature can happen, but the big story running alongside that, as well as the dire situation in Phoenix, is the massive explosion in Times Square at an Army recruitment center. Times Square was absolutely packed with people at the time, lots of protesters, a lot of riot police too, and a huge explosion rocked the area. And it looks as though this could be the deadliest incident of the war so far. Already hundreds of bodies have been pulled from the wreckage and hundreds more are still buried beneath it as nearby buildings or parts of nearby buildings collapsed onto the street. As we said before, there were thousands of people on the street at the time. A protest was taking place, a protest calling for an end to the war, and with the current confusion going on there now, the carnage, the chaos, it's difficult to estimate just how many people may have been killed or injured, but this blast was huge, absolutely massive, and rescuers on the ground have said that the number of those killed could exceed 1,000 people. That is so tragic, so sad. Now, if a militia faction is to blame for this because it has been established that it was a deliberate act, this was not some gas explosion or something, it was deliberate. If a militia faction is responsible for this, this will do irreparable damage to their cause. Their support will take a nosedive nationwide and also internationally, but as yet, no militia group has claimed responsibility. And if a militia is responsible for this, they probably won't be claiming responsibility for it anytime soon, considering the anger and backlash there is going to be because of this. But for now, let's go back to the death of Dalla Rosa. His wife, Melissa Dalla Rosa, released a statement saying that she is heartbroken. Her family are heartbroken. Robert Dalla Rosa was a good man who wanted what was best for everyone. She added that his death will not be in vain, that his legacy will live on through victory in this war. This comes as reports suggest that intelligence agencies and the military know who the individual responsible for orchestrating the president's assassination, not the actual shooter, but the person responsible for orchestrating it. How they know this, we obviously don't know. But in relation to this, Melissa Dalla Rosa added in her statement that, quote, "We know who you are, we are coming for you, you are in the crosshairs," end quote. So, only time will tell if that's true or not. We will have to wait and see. Now back to...
Boss, get out of there, they're coming! Get out now!